Fantasy football is here, so this is my knife sharp tier list of the top 25 running backs in fantasy football right now. Like the video, subscribe, write this stuff down in your notes, do whatever you have to do to remember this information. I'm gonna get right into it. I hate wasting people's times. There's timestamps all throughout this video for my fellow brain rot individuals, so do not worry about that. Number one, Christian McCaffrey. It's pretty easy. He finished as the overall RB1 last year and was 100 fantasy points on top above the RB2. And his situation on the 49ers has barely changed. There hasn't been a whole bunch of free agency signings or coaching changes or any of that big stuff that would affect a running back. Again, it's Christian McCaffrey. None of that really matters, but it's good to know there's a little bit of safety with that. And one thing I like to do is look at sports books and look at the total lines that they have for the entirety of the season, because it can kind of give us a good idea of what to expect for that year. And these Vegas odds have Christian McCaffrey projected for over 100 total yards a game and a touchdown a game. Again, you can't beat that. The only main drawbacks here is a potential injury, and you can't really expect that to happen, so I don't draft on the defense just hoping not to pick a guy that plays and gets injured. And the only other thing I could see an argument for is maybe you want to start your roster construction differently. Maybe you want to start with a wide receiver and go with running backs in the second or third round instead of starting with a running back because you like those guys better. But as always, we need Christian McCaffrey to have his own tier, so S tiers for him. We're dropping down to the A tier to get our next running back here, and this is going to be Breece Hall, and it might come as a bit of a surprise to some people based on last season and the team that we were looking at last season. They just weren't good. They ranked 31st in total offense, and they were last in touchdowns in the red zone. So we look at all this information, we look at the inefficiency, and this team was not good, but Breece Hall still finished as the RB2 in fantasy football last season despite all of those other distractions. But now we have Aaron Rodgers coming back from injury, and he is 1,000% better than all of the quarterbacks they trotted out onto the field last season. Even if he's 40 years old coming off an ACL tear, whatever it was, he's still better. And if you're not an Aaron Rodgers believer, you can agree that at the very least he's going to bring this offense up to average, maybe about that. I think a lot better than average, but Breece Hall was averaging 18 fantasy points a game in an insufficient, terrible offense. If it gets that much better, he's going to score that much more and be that much better in fantasy football. It's a great situation. I love him as the RB2. And they did sign Tyrod Taylor, so if you are worried about Aaron Rodgers getting re-injured, Tyrod Taylor's a fine backup option, better than most, so I really don't have a problem with that either way. He's another year removed from his ACL injury. He's pretty much rehabilitated completely now. He's only 23 years old, a lot of prime left in him. He gets a lot of receiving work. The offensive line got upgraded. It's just a really, really good situation. Going back to our sportsbook odds, the Jets are projected for 10 wins this season, and if you're going to win a lot of games, you're going to score a lot, so there's going to be a lot of fancy points to go around. But moving on to the next guy, number 3 in this same tier is Bijan Robinson. I've had a little bit of a debate deciding who goes where, if Bijan's going to be 1 or he's going to be 2 in the A tier. And there's a few reasons I have it ranked like this. Last year, Bijan finished as the RB9, and those numbers were deflated from the couple games that he just got like 1 or 2 carries and then subbed himself out. So technically, he was about the running back 7, but still managed to have a really good rookie season while splitting carries in a terrible Arthur Smith-led offense that did not want to give him the ball, even though he should have had it. But one of the main upgrades is that there's no longer a Desmond Ridder or Taylor Heineke fighting for that quarterback spot. They have a Kirk Cousins, which has led multiple wide receiver 1 seasons and very good fantasy football options in Minnesota. It's pretty clear that Kirk Cousins can support more than one fantasy option, which means this offense is going to be able to roll even more. They're going to have a better, more efficient offense, more touchdowns, more points, more wins, more everything, which is always good for fantasy football. And the second reason why I'm confident taking him as the RB3 is because they no longer have Arthur Smith, who was pretty much the entirety of the reason he wasn't doing good last season. Again, I just think the upgrade for Breece Hall is a lot better than the upgrade for Bijan Robinson, but they're still really young, amazing running backs. You can flip the two if you want, but I think Breece is going to be over Bijan. But keeping it in this tier, we're going with Jahmyr Gibbs next. I mean, a lot of people might think this is a bit of a jump because we're taking him as the RB4 and he was in a split backfield last year, but the times are changing. Again, looking at the sports books, the Lions are again projected for a top 3 offense and top 3 in scoring. They're going to be great. They're going to win a lot of games just like we saw last season, but last season he was on a snap count. He was on a restriction. Dan Campbell said that multiple times. I had a lot of our Jahmyr Gibbs fantasy owners upset. I had him last year and I was a little upset about it, but it makes a lot of sense. He's a young running back. He's pretty lightweight as far as running backs go. You're not going to get an insane shoveled amount of targets and usage out of nowhere when you're that young. It makes sense, but this year is the year that he's going to blossom. He's not on a snap count anymore, and he will continue to get more work over David Montgomery in the backfield, in the receiving game especially, and on the ground from last season. That is the one drawback everybody has. Montgomery is still going to get involved in this offense, do not get me wrong, but Jahmyr Gibbs is going as the RB5 about in fantasy football, and David Montgomery is going as the RB20. That is a massive jump. The sports books have Jahmyr's total numbers way higher than David Montgomery. Even the fantasy football statistics, everything is pretty much saying that Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be that number 1 guy. At the end of last season, we saw Jahmyr Gibbs take that red zone role little by little from David Montgomery, and when you can run from 20 yards out and still score a touchdown, it's inevitable. You're going to get that role. I do think David Montgomery will be a really important part of this offense NFL-wise, but I don't think his carries and usage is going to translate into fantasy football. But moving down to the next tier, this is when running backs start having a little bit more of red flags, so they're not quite the S or the A tier, but they are still amazing options. Number 1 in this tier is going to be Jonathan Taylor, and if we look at his stats, he is still 100% capable as finishing as an RB1 in fantasy football, like overall. He was the RB33 twice in the last 2 years, dealing with injuries. But in his fully healthy, or as close as you can get to a fully healthy season, he finished as the RB1 and RB6 if you just look at his stats. And he's only 25 years old. I feel like he's been in the league for a really long time. He's been pretty good in fantasy for a long time, but he's still most definitely in his running back prime. He has room to improve still. But we do have Anthony Richardson, and with running quarterbacks that like to run the ball a lot, they're going to steal a couple touchdowns here and there, and instead of dumping the ball off when they get pressure, they're just going to leak out of the pocket and run for it themselves. That's not a detriment to Jonathan Taylor though, because one of the main reasons they lost Zach Moss in the offseason, and that was probably his biggest drawback, because when he was injured last season, Zach Moss was amazing, and now there's really no competition in the backfield. He's going to get a majority, if not a workhorse role. He's big enough and strong enough and experienced enough to take that. He's an easy RB5, book that, go ahead. But the next running back in this tier is going to be Saquon Barkley, and they're kind of in the same situation where they're both running behind running quarterbacks. Jalen Hurts also likes to run the ball a lot. The only difference why I put Saquon behind Jonathan Taylor here is because that tush push very much still exists. Yes, they don't have Jason Kelce. It's going to hurt a little bit, but they know what to do. I'm sure they've coached up the next center coming up. They're going to run the tush push a lot, and Jalen Hurts is big enough, strong enough. He's a quarterback that can do it. We've seen that before. It doesn't matter what his offensive line looks like. And Saquon is getting a little bit older. He's at 28 years old. Jonathan Taylor's only at 25. There's more room for upside in that perspective. And running backs typically, historically, tend to fall off and reach their plateau at around age 28. I don't think Saquon Barkley is going to be trashed all of a sudden, but the statistics say that if anybody's going to defy that, it might be Saquon Barkley. But none of this is making me not like Saquon Barkley. They lost all of their backfield competition. There's no DeAndre Swift. They lost Miles Sanders the year before that. There's really nobody else besides Kenneth Gainwell, and he's not going to get a lot of work. Saquon gets a lot of receiving work. He's been that guy. He is that guy. He's going to help this offense out a ton. He's a fine pick. We're going with Travis Etienne, and this might be a debatable pick just because of how the Jaguars finished last season, but I'm just taking it for what it is. Yes, they lost Calvin Ridley and they lost Zay Jones, but they replaced them with Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas Jr. So is it going to make Trevor Lawrence have to work that much harder? Might the offense be a little bit more inefficient? It's possible, but still, it doesn't worry me. They have more than capable pass catchers in Evan Ingram and Christian Kirk. We'll see what Gabe Davis can do. So this offense is going to be able to move. They're going to be fine. He's going to be able to be a top 10 running back at the very least. But again, Etienne is only 25 years old. He finished as the RB3 last season. This is only his second fully healthy season with the team. The Jaguars offensive line is worse than all these other running backs that I put ahead of him, which is why I ranked them the way I did. But they signed a center over the offseason. They just need their line to get healthy again, which they will be when the season comes back around. I'm not worried about it. If they can stay healthy, he's going to smash his ADP because, again, he doesn't have any competition in the backfield besides Tank Bigsby. We thought he was going to be a big deal last season, but he really didn't get used. But keeping it on this tier, the next running back is going to be Kyren Williams, and I promise you this ranking will change as the season goes on for a few reasons because of his circumstances. And the main reason for this is because his ADP has been absolutely dropping since they drafted Blake Corum in the NFL draft this season. A lot of other fantasy football sites will have him a lot higher than this in round 2. I think that's a little bit too much for me. If he falls into round 3, I'm perfectly fine taking him. This is a guy that averaged 21 fantasy points a game and over 100 rushing yards a game out of literally nowhere. But it's going to be hard for him to repeat or even come close to a season like that again. He is relatively small for the running back position, only 195 pounds. And historically, running backs at that size just can't handle full workhorse loads for that long because they're going to get injured. If they're on the field getting hit by 300-pound linemen, it's just going to happen inevitably. And he was dealing with injuries last year that kept him out for 4 weeks. And the year before that, he was dealing with another foot injury that kept him out for, I think, 5 games, 6 maybe. Well, the one thing that's really keeping me in this area and why I don't mind drafting him is because Sean McVay likes his pass blocking. He said it publicly multiple times, and that's going to get you on the field more when you can do more than just run the ball. And towards the end of this tier is really where I start having issues because I have Devon Achane next in this line. He's the RB9 for me, and I do have a couple drawbacks with this. He was able to finish as the RB24 on straight efficiency last year. He had a 10% touchdown rate, and he really never saw more than 50% of the snaps, and he was averaging 8 yards per carry every single game. That's just not repeatable. You can't do that again. He is in a great offense. He's only a rookie going into his second year, so statistically, he is going to get better, and he will get more work than he did last season because he was only on the field for 50% of the snaps. Will he get more than 7 carries a game like he was averaging last year? Most definitely 100%, but will his efficiency stay as high as it was to get that fantasy point number per game? No. So it's going to even out. They still have Raheem Mostert in this backfield. They drafted Jalen Wright this year, which does kind of confuse me because now they have 3 running backs. They're clearly planning for something, which makes me think if Raheem Mostert were to go down with injury, Devon Achane isn't going to be that workhorse RB1 because they drafted another guy for a reason. It's going to be a split backfield regardless of who is on the field. And everybody's taking him really early in the draft, so I find it hard to believe that he can outperform that RB5 ADP. This range is perfectly fine for me, though. If you think he's going to get more work than I assume, you can take him earlier. I just don't like the idea of it. He is a pretty light running back. He's 185. And again, going back to the stats, you really don't get a workhorse role like that unless you're playing wide receiver, essentially. But keeping it here, I'm liking Josh Jacobs a bit higher than the consensus is. I think he's a fine running back in round 4. This was a guy that was stuck behind a terrible offensive line and quarterback situation with the Raiders, and now he moves to a team with one of the best offenses and a young quarterback that had a lot of promise and threw for 36 touchdowns last year. A way better situation, better offensive line. The Packers are returning 4 out of their 5 offensive linemen. Again, it's going to be great. He's bigger, he's stronger, he's arguably just a better overall running back than Aaron Jones was. And we saw how much success he had with the Packers. And he just signed a 4-year, $48 million deal. If they're paying him that much, he's going to get used. And he is one of the bigger running backs. He's 225 pounds. He can actually continue to have a workhorse level role. He's big enough to sustain that. He does have some backfield competition though, which keeps him a little bit lower on this ranking to where I have him with AJ Dillon and Marshawn Lloyd, who they just drafted. So he might start out a little bit slow. AJ Dillon will probably get less work as the season goes on. His efficiency numbers have been dropping over the past couple years a considerable amount, but he's a great running back still in his prime on a really good offense. It's going to be a great time for Josh Jacobs with the Packers. But our next running back is going to be Isaiah Pacheco, and this guy is just straight up consistent. The Chiefs haven't really done anything to change this offense up. They signed Marquise Brown, which I think will be a good thing. They also got Xavier Worthy, one of the fastest, if not the fastest wide receiver in the draft class and in the world. He'll be a great NFL talent. I don't think it's going to translate much to fantasy football as much as everybody thinks it will, but that's a topic for another video. Again, this offense is just better. And they didn't sign any other running backs in the offseason. They got CEH back, but he really has not proven to be any kind of threat to Isaiah Pacheco. He started to get more receiving work. He's just going to get better as the seasons go on. This offense is getting better. They have Patrick Mahomes at quarterback. That's going to keep you as a top running back in fantasy scoring just because there's so much offense. He's 25. He's young. He gets receiving work. And then we have Derrick Henry. Now, I love the idea of this. Everybody's going to have different ideas and opinions on it. He finished as a top 8 running back 4 out of the 5 seasons that he's played, and the only reason he didn't go 5 for 5 is because he got injured in 2021. And he's built for a big workload. He's 6'2", 230 or something like that. Like, we've seen it. It's facts, it's statistics. He gets a good workload. And now he goes to the Ravens, who have a great offense and not much RB competition in the backfield whatsoever. But because of the fact that he's going to the Ravens and he's a great NFL fit, doesn't necessarily mean he's a great fantasy football fit. He is 30 years old. His usage and just time on field in general has been slowly declining over the past 2 years. And he's getting to that point where it doesn't really make sense to keep him on the field every single play and just let him go do what he does, because he's important to their playoff success and postseason success. So we're going to need to keep him healthy to win the games. He's not just going to be able to go out there and take every rushing attempt because he's good. There's no incentive to keep him on the field, and 100% of running backs in their age 30 season have declined in fantasy points per game. It's just a fact. And he finished as the RB8 last year, so taking those 2 facts into account, there's no way he can finish higher than the RB8, so I'm not taking him anywhere near there. I like him at the RB12. Going down to Joe Mixon, I have him here in this tier as RB13. Everybody has him as the RB15, so I'm a little bit higher on him than others. I just don't see a world where he finishes outside the top 15 running backs. He's managed to stay somewhat healthy throughout his entire career, which is always a plus, even though we can't predict injuries. He's going from a Joe Burrow-led offense, well, I guess half Joe Burrow-led offense from last season because he was injured, to a CJ Stroud-led offense. And you can make the decision if you think CJ Stroud and the Texans are going to be better than the Bengals as far as offense goes, but it's a pretty good team, and it's not a downgrade whatsoever. And he has no running back competition. Now, I know way back when Dameon Pierce was actually a good running back, but last season, he was literally the least efficient running back in the entire NFL. He's not going to take a good amount of workload from him. Probably not much outside of like 3 carries. He's on a great offense, a great pass catching running back. Even if he doesn't get the most receptions on the Bengals, his catch ratio and like the percentage of balls that came his way that he caught was very high. He's a good receiving back. The only downfall you could have with him is all of the wide receiver competition, because CJ Stroud's going to throw a lot when you have Tank Dell, Nico Collins, and Stephon Diggs, but that's just going to make the offense better, and when you get in the red zone, it's going to be Joe Mixon's job. But the next guy here is Rachaad White. He's going at an ADP of 32, which is the RB12. I don't think we should be taking him that high. There's a few reasons for this. If we look at last season, he had the 2nd most usage in the entire NFL when it comes to the running back position, only behind Christian McCaffrey, but barely. You can't even say he's behind him, because he had 336 touches. Christian McCaffrey had 339. But he still wasn't the 2nd best running back in fantasy football with all of that usage he was getting. He was 100 fantasy points behind Christian McCaffrey on the year. Yes, I know he did have a really good season last year. He finished as the RB8. That's way higher than we were drafting him at. But when you're tied essentially with Christian McCaffrey for usage, you can only average 3.5 carries a game and 7 touchdowns on 401 carries. You're not efficient. He's just not. He was not efficient all season. The reason all of this matters is because it's going to be near impossible. I can bank everything on that he will not get that level of usage this year, because they do have Bucky Irving, which nobody is talking about. They drafted him this year. He is going to get usage because Rachaad White just is not efficient. And you might be able to blame some of that on the offensive line, but there is no world where Bucky Irving does not get a considerable amount of time on field. Maybe it won't contribute into carries and receptions, but he's going to split time on field and snaps with him most definitely. And that is what was keeping him so good in fantasy football. He was 2nd in usage, but he averaged 14 fantasy points a game. And now he has competition, real competition in the backfield like there was none last season. I wouldn't take him any higher than the RB10. Keeping it on this tier though, another guy, Kenneth Walker. I really like him. He's a very talented running back, but the situation just holds me back again. Unfortunately, Zach Charbonnet does still exist, and he is going to take usage from Kenneth Walker a little bit more than last season. Kenneth Walker just simply is not going to be a 3-down back. He saw 54% of the snaps last year. And what makes this tough is that Walker got a majority of the rushing work last season, but Charbonnet got a majority of the receiving work, and it canceled out, and it really held back Kenneth Walker. So his ceiling is going to be tough to gauge because we have a guy like Zach Charbonnet that's going to get involved, and he's going to take all of the PPR value, so I can't put him that much higher. I don't think he has a great chance of finishing as a top 5 running back. He will have enough usage to validate his ADP, so he's not a complete sandbag of a pick. He just doesn't have an insanely high ceiling like some of the other running backs before him in this tier. Right next to him, I am taking James Cook, and I do wish his situation was a little bit better. He showed promise last season, and again, the Bills lost Stephon Diggs, and they lost another guy named Gabe Davis, so you'd think he'd be a lot better and have a jump this season, which he probably will. They drafted another running back in Ray Davis this year, and they also have Josh Allen, who is the most run-heavy quarterback in the league. He's going to take a lot of touchdowns and fantasy points and rushing attempts, but he is efficient and he's great in the receiving game. I don't mind taking him at this ADP. He's going into his 3rd year, so he should continue to increase his snap count and just get more usage as the season goes on. I'm perfectly fine with it. And speaking of upside, Alvin Kamara is going to be next on this list. The Saints, by no means, are an amazing team. His efficiency continues to drop for the 4th straight year, and he's turning 29 years old. Again, going back to this running back cap of their prime, it's just a fact, unfortunately. But I can trust Derek Carr to be a little bit better in his 2nd year with the Saints, and he also does pass the ball a decent amount, and he was playing through injury for a lot of last season. And Kamara gets an insane amount of receiving work. As long as those other running backs in the backfield don't start chipping away at that, he'll be a fine fantasy option. It's just, again, doesn't have much of a ceiling. We're going with Aaron Jones. This one is, again, unfortunate. He's going to a worse team in Minnesota. It depends how much you trust JJ McCarthy. Me personally, I don't think that offense is going to be anywhere near as good as the Packers offense will be, but he's going to be 30 this season. The decline is already kind of happening. He has injury history. Do I think he can be a 3-down running back? Probably not. They do have Ty Chandler, which is kind of a sleeper in my opinion. If you need to watch any of the other videos on my channel, go ahead and do it to get that insight. And we're taking him as the RB18. I think the ceiling for him would probably be RB13, but even that's a stretch. I wouldn't recommend it. And even in Green Bay, Aaron Jones was starting to lose some of his usage and workload to AJ Dillon, who has been decreasing in efficiency. But speaking of decreasing efficiency, we do have Najee Harris next up in this list, which does kind of suck because he's only 26 years old, but I think there's a lot of outside factors you could blame that on, because you could argue he wasn't 100% all season long last season, which is why he kind of lowered his fantasy numbers. And he had a surge of usage and just a really good end of the season last year. He's averaging 25 carries a game and 100 total yards, so he's not a complete throwaway by any means. I still think Najee Harris is a great running back, but we also still have Jalen Warren in this offense, and he's only getting better. They did bring in Arthur Smith into this offense, which is probably going to help the run game. He led the Falcons to a top 10 season in rushing efficiency and just rushing yards in general, which is great when you look at the Falcons offense. But again, I would argue that Bijan is better than both of these running backs combined. But you have a lot of backfield competition, so his ceiling is capped. And if we have Justin Fields at quarterback for this season, then it's going to be a little bit tough for him to outperform his ADP, but that's a conversation for another day when we decide who that starting quarterback is. And then we have David Montgomery, who in my opinion is a pretty hit or miss pick, and I'll get into that. The only reason I see fit to draft David Montgomery is if you want security for Jahmyr Gibbs. Maybe you drafted him in the 1st round, or if one of your friends has Jahmyr Gibbs and you kind of want to take that value from him and force a trade if Jahmyr Gibbs were to ever miss time, and David Montgomery would be a great running back in that case. But we don't really want to be playing fantasy football on the defense, especially when we get down to these later rounds of fantasy football. That's where the Pukas and the Nico Collins of last season are living. But I fully expect him to lose a good amount of his red zone role this season, like we saw at the end of last season. Jahmyr Gibbs, when we talked about him earlier, was getting a good amount of that. And it's one of those situations where I think his NFL value isn't going to translate well to what his actual fantasy football numbers end up being. He's going to get a lot of those throwaway usage running attempts. Not in the red zone, not that much receiving work. He's going to block for sure, but it's just not going to turn to fantasy points, and that's my fear. I don't think he's going to outperform his ADP unless Jahmyr Gibbs gets injured. If you think that's going to happen, I'm fine with drafting him. But Tony Pollard is the next running back on this list, and everybody's forgot about him. I guess that's what happens when you go to the Titans. But it's not completely over for him. He still has some incentive to be drafted in this back end of running backs. The biggest drawback people have is the involvement of Tajay Spears. If he was able to get usage and almost tie his snap percentage with prime Derrick Henry, even if you don't want to call him in his prime, Derrick Henry's a way better running back than Tony Pollard was, and he still cut out a role there. It's definitely going to be a split backfield here 100%. And if you look at this offense, it looks like they're going more pass heavy. They have DeAndre Hopkins, they have Calvin Ridley, they also have Tyler Boyd, and they brought Brian Callahan into this offense. So it's a lot of changing parts. If you think Will Levis can be that good of a quarterback and keep this offense going, he has a lot of opportunities with the weapons he has. And they did sign some better offensive linemen in the offseason. I think he has potential, but again, if he's splitting carries with Tajay Spears, and if Tajay Spears gets the receiving role, he's not going to translate the fantasy football value. I think he's a sleeper, I guess, if Tajay Spears doesn't get involved or he gets injured. We can't bank on that, though. The next running back we have here is James Conner, and this one just kind of hurts. He's 29 years old. He's getting up there, and he quite literally has not had a healthy season ever. He misses 4, maybe 5 games a season on average. And what really sucks is that when James Conner gets injured, the backup running backs come in and do absolutely amazing. We saw that with Amari DeMarcado last season, and now they have another running back in Trey Benson who is way better than any of the backups they had last year, which I think is another sleeper. Shout out to that video that you guys will see soon. But the team is good. They made some upgrades. They got Marvin Harrison Jr. They got Trey McBride and Kyler Murray. It's going to be a great offense. I think the team's going to be a lot better. It just depends on how much work Trey Benson's going to get in this offense. And I think it's going to be a good amount considering James Conner's going to miss a couple games this season. It's pretty much a given now. But next up, a guy I am kind of eyeing for now to see where his ADP goes is DeAndre Swift. And a lot of people are sleeping on him because the Bears offense has a lot of opportunities. They have a lot of weapons. They have DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze. They have Cole Kmet, if you want to call him that. And he definitely does have some backfield competition with Khalil Herbert and with Roschon Johnson, who both managed to get some work last season. This backfield could very well just end up a complete committee and be bad for DeAndre Swift, but he has receiving upside. He's a good running back. I think he should continue to be the RB1, but there's always a chance that there's so many options, there's so many weapons and running backs as well in this offense that he just doesn't get the workload to get to that point. He has a way higher ceiling than people are giving him credit for, but that risk also comes with it. But next up, we got Zach Moss, who's been getting a lot of hype from the offseason from everybody in fantasy football, which I can see why people say that. He is a pretty good sleeper in my opinion, because when he was filling in for Jonathan Taylor last season, he was absolutely amazing, and now he gets to be the RB1 for the Bengals that lost Joe Mixon. I will say he is getting a little bit overhyped, but his only backfield competition is Chase Brown, who given opportunities last season just was not great. So if you like the chances of Zach Moss becoming the full-blown 3-down running back workhorse for the Bengals, most definitely take him. I'm sure it doesn't hurt for the ADP that he's going at, and it all depends on how much they use him this season. I expect him to start kind of slow and then get more acclimated into the season as it goes on, so if he's a trade for target later in the year, you know why. And to finish off this list, I do have Ramondre Stevenson. If you've seen any of my other videos, you know why he's this low. And this just comes down to situation again. The Patriots have never really been sold on him. If they had the choice, at least, they signed Zeke. They split the backfield with them, both of them combined, and now they have Antonio Gibson that they got from the Commanders last season. And if you see that jersey back there, I am a Commanders fan, so I have a little bit of information on him. And he was primarily a receiving back. He didn't get a lot of the work, but he got a lot of receiving, and he was on the field for passing plays. That's exactly what Ramondre Stevenson thrives off of in fantasy football. So if he manages to split his receiving role that he had last season with Antonio Gibson now, I don't see much room for a ceiling. It's just not going to happen. If you trust Drake May, maybe you can take him higher. You might check down a little bit, but again, Antonio Gibson's going to be in this offense. Is going to be split 50-50. But that was a long video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I am a little bit sick while recording this, so if the energy level isn't there, my voice sounds raspy or something, let me know. It is what it is. I got to get this content out for you guys. I seriously appreciate you watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next video coming soon. That will be the wide receiver tiers, by the way.